Hello, and welcome to A Ghostly Experience. I'm Sandy Craig, and I will be joined by Michelle Gastineau and Tommy Bledsoe to tell you some stories. The stories you will hear are about people who have lived in St. Augustine, Florida, who have died here, and who continue to appear here long after they have died. Very little is known about what these spirits are, why they are here, and why some people see them, while others never do. Maybe you have your own story to tell, but for now, listen. Listen to these stories and the events that caused them, because you aren't the first, and you won't be the last to have a ghostly experience.
Didn't you hear it? The sound of heavy boots. All these years, every time I hear the step of heavy boots, it sends chills up and down my spine. I can never forget that first job of mine. I hadn't been here in St. Augustine very long, you see, and I was going down St. George Street, looking for a house number 49, the Paff family. I says to myself now, Maggie Hunter, don't you be taking this as a bad omen, the weather. You see, there was a hurricane a-brewing. The wind was blowing, and the rain, it was stinging my skin. Finally, there it was, number 49. I knocked at the door, and I looked about to see that, just as I'd been told, the downstairs portion of the building, it was a printing and a stationery shop on one side, and the other side was a toy store. A young man, he opened the door to me. He told me he was the grandson of the matriarch of the family, Mrs. Paff, and he lived upstairs with his grandmother. He led me up a long flight of stairs. Then the boy went off to himself, to his own room. I could see through the half-opened door that he was a ham radio operator. I could hear the squeaks and the squeals as he turned the dials. As I was left to make my way through the house, I looked down the long hallway and had my first glimpse at my patient, Mrs. Paff. Poor thing. She'd gotten quite old and frail. She was nearly lost in the large white bed. She appeared to be sleeping, so I decided to make myself at home. I went into the kitchen to warm a glass of milk. And when I'd finished, I brought the milk back out into the hallway, and I noticed that Mrs. Paff, she'd been joined by a nun. Sister was kneeling on the floor next to the bed, and since the two of them appeared to be in prayer, I decided not to disturb them. I went back down the hallway to the boy's room, and I asked him, "Lad, who might the nun be who's visiting with your grandmother?" Without raising his head to answer me, he said, "Grandmother says that the nun always comes to her when she's in pain and times of need." And as I turned to go back down the hall once more to Mrs. Paff's room, I could see that she was now alone. I couldn't understand how the nun could have come down the hall and the flight of stairs just past me without me having seen or heard her. I decided to put the whole thing out of my mind. The next few weeks were uneventful. My patient, she got neither better nor worse. And one night, I was warming a cup of broth in the kitchen. I'd put it on a tray, and I was just leaving the kitchen to go down to Mrs. Paff's room, and I heard a noise coming behind me. There were steps, heavy steps. I saw a large man, a soldier, a Spanish soldier, coming down the hall. I jumped back out of his way. I dropped the tray and spilled the broth. I went running down the hall to the boys' room. I said, Lad, come quick. There's a man, a Spanish soldier, making his way to your grandmother's room. For the first and only time, he showed some emotion. He jumped up, terror in his eyes. He knocked back his chair and ran past me down the hall. I followed as quickly as I could. When I arrived, I found the boy alone with his grandmother. He was crumpled on the floor beside her bed, holding her thin hand, and he was sobbing. Between the sobs, I could hear snatches of what he said. Why? Why did he have to come? It was then, for the first time, that I realized my patient, she was no longer struggling for breath. There was no rise and fall of her chest. I walked over to the bed slowly and took her hand in mine. I felt for a pulse, but there was none. Finally, he looked up at me. With a tear-stained face and red eyes, he said, Grandmother always told me that the nun, she'd come to her when she needed her, but when it was her time to go, a soldier would come for her.
Spanish St. Augustine was a walled city. If you were Catholic, you could be buried inside the city walls. If you were Protestant, you would be buried outside the walls. Just outside the old city gates is the Huguenot Cemetery. This public burying ground was created following the yellow fever epidemic of 1821, when hundreds of people, Catholic and Protestant, died. There are about 120 known grave sites, but many more are buried in unmarked or mass graves. Their names will never be known. However, just inside the cemetery gates, beneath a large live oak tree, stands the stately marker for the Honorable Judge John B. Stickney.
I moved to Old Augustine from Lynn, Massachusetts in 1866. Those were the Reconstruction years, and my services were needed here in Florida. You see, I was no ordinary carpetbagger seeking to line my pockets with the spoils of a defeated Confederacy. I moved here to set up a law practice, to protect and defend the rightful laws of the state, but I soon came to love this charming southern town. My children were born here. But alas, tragedy struck us when, after the birth of my third child, my wife died. I continued to work here, employing dear Mrs. Sanchez as governess to the children. This was especially necessary when I left town on my regular, though infrequent, business trips to Washington, D.C. to see my colleague John Long. In 1882, I prepared for one such trip. As the day of departure approached, I did not feel well. I thought it to be a minor ailment, so I said my goodbyes and departed. That 3-day journey to Washington was pure misery for me. John Long met me at the railway station and straightway took me to a physician. I barely remember the diagnosis: typhoid fever. There was little they could do for me. But in my final hours, I was comforted in the knowledge that John Long would care for my children, and my body would be returned to St. Augustine to rest forever peacefully in the land I love.
Dear Mr. George Wells, it has been 21 years since my father, Judge John B. Stickney, died. My 2 siblings and I were left in the care of Judge John Long here in Washington, D.C., after my father's burial in your Huguenot cemetery in St. Augustine, Florida. Regrettably, the Honorable Judge Long has recently passed away, and I would like to request of you the exhumation of my natural father's body. You see, my family feels that it would be a fitting tribute to these 2 men to have them buried next to each other here in Washington. I have inquired, and as I am assured that you are of honorable character, I have enclosed the necessary sum of money to cover expenses for the exhumation and subsequent shipping of my father's body. Sincerely yours, Marjorie Emma Stickney Samuels.
Exhumation. A dreadful prospect I had not considered. But when the sun burst through my coffin, I realized that peace was forever denied me. My bones are placed, respectfully of course, in a new coffin, as the curious crowd gazes upon my remains. But what's this? Loud, boisterous, drunken voices intercede this solemn occasion as my skull is handled roughly. Mr. Wells demands the departure of the 2 drunken sots. He then proceeds to complete the transfer, but notices that the interlopers have taken something valuable from me. My gold teeth, with the sunlight glinting off them, were too much of a temptation for them, I suppose, for I no longer enjoy their company. What an ignominious fate! But I am not without recourse, for although my physical remains are in Washington, D.C., my spirit still haunts the Huguenot cemetery. Look for my marker. I'll be watching for you.
Have you seen the ghost of John? Long white beard and no skin on. Ooh, wouldn't it be cold with no skin on?
St. Augustine is a romantic city, and nowhere is that romance more poignant than in the stories of the spirits who roam the Talamata Cemetery. There you will find the eternal bride-to-be waiting for her groom. And she is not the only one. If you listen closely, you might hear the soft song of the maiden who was spared from death by one who loved her, only to be given up for dead by one she loved.
San Gabriel, come potala mishiada, das nostras redas astaran vasprenada. Yaumuliada, tu vavas aquara serventa, frata dea cantanta, para folocoeval, de sarem la dola. Who's there? Colonel Smith? Colonel Joseph Smith, is it you? No. So many new faces here in St. Augustine, now that we are a U.S. territory. Do you know Colonel Smith? Is he with you? I am sorry. You must forgive me. You see, I am alone, here at the gates of the Talamato Cemetery. At least that hideous Apopanox tree no longer stands here at the corner, with its gnarled branches and its long thorns. I do not know the year they took it down, but I am glad of it. Are you sure you do not know Colonel Smith? Do you not remember? When he arrived here in 1823, he was the highest-ranking military officer. We gave him parties, meriendas and mass balls. I was invited to the largest of these parties. All of the ladies wore their finest dresses, and I a new black lace mantilla. I admit, when my eyes met those of Colonel Smith for the first time, had I not already been a married woman from a fine Spanish family, my heart might have been given over to him that night, but as it was, my husband was at my side, so we greeted Colonel Smith, and we danced and talked, and at the end of the evening, we said goodbye, and my husband and I returned home. But that is the night my fevers began. For 7 days, my fevers raged. I was so weak I could not speak, and I had many terrible dreams. I dreamed that I could hear my mother and my father sobbing, grieving. Someone very close to us must have died. They planned a funeral. You see, my family has a very unique funeral custom. We carry our dead to their burial place in an upright, in a sitting position, in the arms of the pallbearers. I dreamed that I was floating, and I could feel the warmth of the sun on my skin again. And suddenly I felt a sharp pain, and I heard a voice cry out. It was Colonel Smith. He said, "Stop! Stop, I tell you! I've seen her eyes flutter!" And all around me, I heard the murmurs of a large crowd of people. They said, "Colonel Smith is insane. Poor man must be deluded." And I continued to float. And again, I heard a voice. It was Colonel Smith saying, "Stop, I tell you! I saw her move!" And even as I drifted down, I heard a voice very close to my ear. It was my husband. He said, Look at her temple there. There's a drop of blood forming. One of the thorns from the tree must have scratched her. Quickly, take her up and home." And they returned me to my bed. I lived on another 6 years here in my city. But what was the quality of my life? My illness? It had robbed me of my youth and left me barren. My husband no longer spent his time with me. And then my fevers returned. My mind screamed, "No, not this nightmare again, please, no." But I could not speak. Again, I felt my body drifting down the street. And as they turned to enter the Talamato, again I heard a voice cry out. But it was not the voice of Colonel Smith, but that of my own husband, as he told the pallbearers not to go too close to the Apopanox tree this time. The last thing I remember was the darkness and the cold. But wait, it is not too late. No, it is not too late. A favor, my new friends. Please, go and find Colonel Smith. Go and find Colonel Joseph Smith. Send him here. Send him here to me. Please, tell him that I live. Please, hurry. Go and find Colonel Smith. Send him here to me. Please, I beg you, send him here to me. Please, send him. Please.
This story is about the house that stands on the edge of the Tolomato Cemetery. It's a bed and breakfast now, but 85 years ago, a woman lived there who had 2 nephews. They loved to play in this cemetery, and they talked about spending the night in the cemetery. Finally, their aunt said, "Okay, bring your tent over here on Saturday. You can set it up during the day, spend the night, and then we'll go to Mass on Sunday morning and get you back with your parents." So they did it. They set up the tent, then it started to get dark. And the boys started to have second thoughts, but they couldn't back out, so they settled in. The boys drifted off to sleep. Of course, it was a lot darker and a lot quieter 85 years ago, and something in the night woke one of the boys. Of course, he woke the other one, and between the 2 of them, they heard lots of noises. They decided it was time to go back in the house. As they left the tent, they looked back toward the rear of the cemetery, and they saw a woman. She looked like an old woman with long white hair dragging the ground behind her, dressed in a white gown, and she was just floating across the back of the cemetery. Well, that terrified those 2 boys. They ran into the house screaming about this old woman down there in the Tolomato Cemetery. Their aunt believed them, and she went down to see if she could see this ghost. She saw nothing, so she went back inside, settled the boys down, and they spent the rest of the night close by her side. The next morning, time for Mass. Yes, they did go to Mass, very willingly, and after Mass they were standing around outside, telling their parents and anyone else who would listen about this old woman they saw at the Tolomato. One of the parishioners stopped them and said, "No, you didn't see an old woman. I know who you're talking about, but she's not an old woman at all. She was quite a young woman. She was days away from being married. She had everything prepared. The church was reserved. Her groom was waiting. Her wedding dress was made. And she died suddenly. And because she was so close to her wedding day, they buried her in her wedding dress. What you saw was not an old woman, but it was the eternal bride-to-be waiting for her groom." This story's been around for a long time, but in May of 1998, one of the guides brought a ghost tour by the cemetery, and as she walked up, there was a young couple standing by the gate, looking back toward the back of the cemetery. She said, "Good evening. I'm going to tell a story about this cemetery. You're welcome to stay if you'd like." They said, "No, we just wanted to see if we could see the woman." Well, she thought they'd been on the tour or perhaps heard the story somewhere, so she told everyone the story I just told you. When she finished, she found out that they had never heard the story before, nor had they been on the tour. But the night before, they'd stayed in the Cordova house. They were newlyweds on their honeymoon, and they had decided to take a late-night stroll down the street. As they walked past the gates to the Tolomato, they looked back, and they saw the eternal bride-to-be.
Sanchez, her dugout launches, and down the streams to catch some crabs she makes her way. A Spanish maiden with crabs well laden, when evening falls she lifts her trawls to cross the bay. grim terror blushes. Maria Sanchez, who not to put too fine a point is rather brown. A norther coming, already humming, doth bear away that Spanish maiden far from town. Maria Sanchez, caught in the branches that sweetly droop across the creek far down the coast. That calm spectator, the alligator, does spy then wait to call his mate who rules the roost. She comes and crunches Maria Sanchez, while boating crabs the gentle husband meekly chews. How could they eat her, that senorita, whose story still doth make quite ill the Spanish muse?
One of the most frequently asked questions is, which of the bed and breakfasts is the most haunted? In the opinion of some people, the answer to that question would be the St. Francis Inn. The inn is one of the older buildings in St. Augustine, being used as a B&B, as parts of that building date all the way back to 1791. The ghost story, which is frequently repeated to visitors, is a tragic love story. It seems that the lovely, dark-skinned Lily, a slave girl, had fallen madly in love with the nephew of her master, an owner of the home between 1855 and 1888, General Hardee of the Confederate States of America. And the general's nephew, well, he had fallen hopelessly in love with Lily. The two young people were eventually caught together in a small attic room on the 3rd floor. Because of the harsh threats of the enraged uncle, the young man hung himself in that 3rd-story room rather than be sent away to military service. And Lily? No one is certain of her fate. But many say that the grieving uncle sent the slave girl far away. Today, room 3A of the St. Francis Inn is often said to be the site of many unusual events. Guests who occupy the room overnight tell us stories. Some of the women have reported that Lily must have entered their room during the night and played in their makeup, for when they awake in the morning, the room is dusted in face powder. Some say that the lights in this room go off and on at will. Now, the employees of the St. Francis Inn have said that they've seen Lily going down the hallway, holding a large stack of towels, and as she enters a room, they follow and search, but find no trace of her. One of the most unusual sightings in the inn was on the staircase. A small, dark woman's hand was seen moving up the handrail of the stairs. But not those stairs that you as a guest might use. You see, there is yet another staircase that few ever use or know exists. It was used only by the servants and slaves, like young Lily, who lingers still close to room 3A.
One of the most prominent landmarks in St. Augustine is the fort, Castillo de San Marcos. It was built of over 400,000 blocks of coquina, a natural shellstone quarried on Anastasia Island, just across the Matanzas River from the fort. It took the Spanish 23 years to build, and it has stood since 1695, unconquered. It has allowed the Spanish, the British, the Confederate States, the Union States, and the United States to defend this land we know as Florida. There are many stories about the fort, including one about Dr. Frederick Whedon.
The Seminole Wars were terrible times in St. Augustine. Such a time of frustration for the citizens and even for the soldiers. It seemed that no matter how many soldiers were set against this ragged band of refugees, runaways, and remnants of many displaced southeastern Indian tribes, they could not defeat them. It was like catching smoke in a butterfly net. No doubt it was because of Osceola. Osceola, brave leader of the Seminole people, or mixed-breed savage, depending on who you talk to. The truth is probably neither, or both, at the same time. But he was a master of trickery and deception. Is it any wonder then that General Jessup came up with his plan, his trick? He called Osceola to talk peace, south of St. Augustine. Osceola came with 70 of his people under a white flag of truce. There, he was surrounded by 200 armed soldiers and taken prisoner. October 1837. He was imprisoned at Fort Marion, the one the Spanish called Castillo de San Marcos. It was an embarrassment, to be sure, but at least the fighting stopped. Osceola became ill, and I was called to treat him. It was a respiratory ailment, bronchitis, but he did not respond to my treatments. He wanted none of my treatments, so his condition worsened, to the point that it was decided he should be moved to Charleston, South Carolina. There was some hope that he would get better there, but in truth it was a way to keep him from dying here, so close to his people, under these conditions. Early January 1838 he was moved. I went with him, but I saw little chance for him. On January 30th, Osceola died. To keep down trouble, we buried him there at Fort Moultrie. Oh, I know what you're thinking. You didn't bury all of him, did you, Dr. Whedon? No, I didn't. Before he was buried, I removed his head. Certainly he had no further use for it. For what better purpose could this head go than for science, for phrenology? Phrenology, the study of the cranium, the skull, for thereby one can predict such traits as intelligence, behavior, aptitude, many important characteristics. And certainly it would benefit science to know more about this man, this Osceola. The head came back to St. Augustine with me for my research. I'm sure some of you have heard the stories of how I would discipline my children with the head, that I would lock them in the room when they misbehaved, placing the head of Osceola on the bedpost to watch over them. Now what kind of a man would do such a thing to a child? More than once or twice. And yes, I did give the head to my daughter when she got married. I wanted her to take it back to New York with her and her new husband, and then on to Boston, to the first medical, surgical, and pathological museum. It had just opened there. There it would be safe for science. Or so I thought. The museum burned. And of course, Osceola's head is now no good to anyone, is it? Oh, there are some who say that Osceola appears in St. Augustine.
There are others who say a headless man appears. I know that to be likely. That headless man who was Wiley Thompson, Indian agent, whom Osceola shot with a rifle that Wiley Thompson had given him. And then Wiley Thompson was beheaded. Wiley Thompson was my brother-in-law. Science, revenge, you decide. You decide why Osceola lost his head.
Before the National Park Service took over the fort, local guides gave tours of the fort for tips. They soon discovered that the more elaborate the story, the better the tips. The bones accidentally discovered in the San Carlos Bastion during the territorial period fueled many stories.
I'll tell you a story about the fort. In the 1830s, this fort was called Fort Marion, and it was occupied by the United States troops stationed here when Florida was a territory. There was a man named Lieutenant Stephen Tuttle who was in charge of a detail of men who were cleaning around the cannons on the gun deck, the second floor of that fort. They were pushing one of those 2,000-pound cannons back from the curtain when all of a sudden, whoo! The cannon crashed through the roof and disappeared into the bowels of the fort. A big noise, a big cloud of dust, and a big problem. How to get that cannon out of the fort, out into the plaza, and then back up the ramp to the gun deck, in the meantime fixing the hole. They figured the best way to do it was to go downstairs and find the room that the cannon had landed in, get it out into the plaza, and back up the ramp. They thought they knew this fort pretty well. They had been here for about 15 years. Well, they went downstairs, they checked the room where they expected to find the cannon. No cannon. They checked the room next to it. No cannon. They looked all around. They could not locate this 2,000-pound hunk of metal. Well, they knew how to find it. They went back upstairs, lowered a soldier down into the hole on a rope, and of course he found the cannon. He found that the cannon had fallen into a sealed room that had at one time been a stairway between the first and second floor. Someone had sealed the exit with logs and coquina blocks, and they had sealed the doorway, and you couldn't tell it was there. Well, besides the cannon, they found something else. They found skeletons. 2 of them. A skeleton of a man and a skeleton of a woman chained to the wall. Well, naturally, they started trying to figure out who these people were and how they came to be in this tomb. They looked at the evidence, the shackles, the clothing that remained, and they deduced that this probably had happened during the Second Spanish period. Now, the Second Spanish period had ended in 1821, so this would probably have put it 50 years in the past. So they went and they checked through the Spanish records, because the Spanish kept detailed records of their colonies, but they could find nothing about this in the record book. Well, then they went to the other record. They went out here in town and they told what they had found, and they listened to the stories that people told. And they found a story that had been floating around for many years that had never been proven, but had never been disproved either. It was a story about Colonel Garcia Martí, the commandant of the fort during the Second Spanish period, who had come here at a time when Spain was not at her strongest. But the colonel was determined that St. Augustine was going to be a jewel in the Spanish crown. When he came here, he brought his beautiful wife with him. And it wasn't long after he got here he discovered his beautiful wife had fallen in love with one of the beautiful soldiers. Now the colonel did not like this, and he sentenced his wife and her lover to be chained to the wall in this stairway, having sealed the exit, and then the doorway was sealed, and they were left there to die together. Now, there's a reason this story has been around for a long time. If you go over on the seawall by the northeast bastion, Now these bastions, these points of the fort, have names. They're named for the saints that protected the Spanish. There's San Augustine, San Pedro, San Paulo, and the big one on the northeast that's called San Carlos. If you go on the seawall by San Carlos sometimes at night, when the wind is still and the water is quiet, you can hear voices. A man's voice and a woman's voice, whispering to each other. And you can smell a woman's perfume.
St. Augustine is graced with many beautiful bed and breakfast inns. One of them is located at 22 Avenida Menendez, the Casa de la Paz. This building was built on our bayfront late in the Victorian age. 1915. It was built by one of the local bankers. Just a few years ago, the building was purchased and major renovations were done. The gentleman who owned it wanted to open a bed and breakfast inn, and he decided to throw himself an open house. A guest at that party that evening was seated on a sofa in the living room area, and her host was standing on the bottom step of the staircase. He had raised a glass and he was making a toast to the opening of his new business. The guest said she noticed that there was a young woman coming down the stairs, above and behind the speaker. This young woman was dressed in a long skirt, she was wearing a jacket, and a wide, broad-brimmed hat. She was carrying a small bag, and this young woman waited on the stairs. The guest thought she would try to interrupt her host, to let him know that someone was descending the stairs behind him, and as she tried to interrupt him, her host just talked louder. He would not be interrupted. He was determined to finish this long toast. Well, after a few moments, the young woman on the stairs turned and she went back up to the second floor. The guest was really very embarrassed, and her feelings were hurt. She made up her mind that she was going to leave the party at the very first opportunity. And when her host had finally finished his toast, she got up. She was heading for the front door. Her host stopped her. He put his hand on her shoulder and he said, "I'm really very sorry. What were you trying to tell me?" She was flustered and she blurted out, "Well, I just wanted you to know that this young woman upstairs was welcome to come and sit next to me and join the party." He questioned her. What young woman? She described this young woman to him, her long skirt, her hat, and her host began to shake his head. "No," he said, "you don't understand. There is no young woman upstairs. You see, they explained to me when I purchased this building that years ago it had been a boarding house, and there were a group of people that came into St. Augustine, and they were guests in this boarding house. Among them, this young woman. She grew very ill, and she died here. After her funeral, the rest of her friends left the city. Now, whenever she's seen, it's generally in the upstairs hallway and as far down as the first landing on the staircase. She's always wearing her traveling suit and carrying a small tapestry, a traveling bag. You see, everyone feels that she wants to leave the building, but she can't. She's waiting for her friends to come back for her. I've even heard that there are people who lived in this building and heard a light tap on their door, and they say they've heard a female voice asking, 'Is it time to go yet?' But when they open the door, there's no one there."
sight to see. You may think she's happy and free from care. She's not, though she seems to be. 'Tis sad when you think of a wasted life, for you cannot mate with age, and her beauty was sold for an old man's gold. She's a bird in a gilded cage.
My husband, Henry Morrison Flagler, would often say, "Mary Lily, sing for me." I never denied a single request of my husband, and he felt the same about me. You see, I was proud to be his third wife, even though I was some 3 decades younger than my famous husband. There'd been so much tragedy in Henry's life, after all. His first wife, Mary Harkness, had succumbed to respiratory problems. His second wife, Ida Alice, had to be institutionalized. Poor thing, she was deemed hopelessly insane. After a much publicized divorce, we were soon married. We endured the gossip of the sharp tongues, and we found happiness in spite of them. My husband's fame as a co-founder of Standard Oil Corporation, builder of the Florida East Coast Railroad, as well as his series of large, beautiful hotels here in Florida, was already legendary. So when, in 1913, at age 83, he fell on the staircase at Whitehall, our beautiful marble mansion in Palm Beach, it was devastating to hear the diagnosis of the doctors: a broken hip. Within weeks, my beloved Henry had passed away. We placed his body on one of his own railroad coaches, and the train made its way slowly northward following the coastline. Thousands of mourners lined the tracks to pay tribute to my late husband. Our destination was St. Augustine. That is where the family mausoleum lies, inside the Memorial Presbyterian Church. Henry had this church constructed as a memorial to his daughter Jenny Louise, who had died of childbirth complications. Upon arriving in the ancient city, Henry's body was placed for public viewing in the lobby of his favorite hotel, the Ponce de Leon. Hundreds filed past his open casket to pay their last respects to Henry Morrison Flagler. That evening, after the mourners had departed, and I prepared for the funeral which would come the following day, a bizarre event occurred. There was a young custodian in the lobby area that night, and he was sweeping. Although there was not a hint of the slightest breeze that night, there suddenly came a strong gust of wind, and it blew the massive front doors of the hotel shut. The loud noise caused the heavy lid of the casket to slam. A swirl of light rose from the casket, and it circled up and up until it reached the rotunda's dome far above the casket. And then the light came quickly crashing down. It glanced off the mosaic tiles on the floor, just a few feet in front of the young man. As the light dissipated, the young man, who was frozen with fear, managed to gather his wits about him, and he took just a few steps forward. There, in the small tile, was the face of my beloved Henry. And it's there, even now, just a few paces to the left, inside the front door of what is now Flagler College.
Prohibition, the Volstead Act, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, outlawed the manufacture, sale, possession, or consumption of alcoholic beverages in the entire country. If I had my say about it, it would be against the law to even think about that poison. I'm a G-man, a government agent. My job is to stop the flow of illegal whiskey coming onto the southern coast. Georgia and Florida mostly. Seems like every thug with a boat and a compass went into rum running after the dry law passed. There are thousands of little coves just big enough to hide a boatload of hooch. It's a tough job. That's why it takes smarts. You gotta get to know the right people in the right places. Like St. Augustine, for instance. We knew there was a lot of traffic there. We just couldn't get a handle on who was doing the deed. Then we got a message from this nice widow lady who ran a boarding house. Said she might be able to help us catch some of the scoundrels. Suggested we might even consider staying with her when we came to town. Her place is right on the river. Perfect spot to keep an eye on the boat traffic. And it was a beautiful place, too. Big porches upstairs and down. Widow's watch all around the top of this joint. A real class act. The widow's boarding house.
Hey, you folks out there, come on up here and have a drink. Oh, you may think that some people did a fine job of turning this into some nice bed and breakfast, the Casablanca by name, but it's still really my boarding house. Always will be in my mind. I've been here a long time. For many years now, I've been keeping a watchful eye out there on the water. It's a habit I got into all those years ago when those smarty-pants government boys, they thought they was gonna put an end to the fun me and my friends and guests was having here at my home. Now, I'm not ashamed to admit that, as a widow, I had to work hard and do whatever I could to make ends meet, even if that meant breaking that so-called prohibition law to do it. There's money to be made in that stuff, legal or not. Besides, I was kind of sweet on one of those fellas that was coming up here from Jamaica with some pretty stout rum. Those G-men, they was so gullible. I had them convinced that I was gonna help them, tip them off whenever the rum runners was about to put into St. Augustine. Truth is, I wanted them staying right here so I could keep an eye on them every minute, day and night. And then I could warn my sweetie out there when not to come ashore by going up there on my widow's walk and waving my lantern back and forth as a signal. It worked like a charm, too. My fellas never got caught, and I'd get my rum eventually, even if the shipment did have to be delayed for the return trip or for the next run. Then they'd just double my order, and we'd party all the more when I did get to throw my arms around his neck next time. Of course, I'm not stupid. I did feed some information about some of those other crews. Not on my boys, though. Just cutting down on the competition and keeping my cover. Those idiots. Those government boys never did catch on. One thing still troubles me, though. That last run the boys made, the weather turned bad, and the G-men were here. I went up, and I signaled my man to stay away. Well, weeks went by, and not a sign of him. He never showed up, and nobody could tell me for sure if his boat sunk or what. I still watch for my man's boat. I still climb the stairs to my roof with my lantern, and I wave it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
We hope you have enjoyed this journey through the familiar and the unexplainable. There are lots more stories here in Old St. Augustine. Come walk with us and have a ghostly experience.